Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this very special Zoom meeting. We are celebrating this year the death of Olive Schreiner 100 years ago. She was really a most remarkable woman, and I'm very pleased that I'm able to welcome Andrew and Christine here this morning, who are going to tell us a little bit more about the life and work of this very interesting woman. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Letitia. Good morning. For too many people, Olive Schreiner is known only as the writer of the story of an African farm. There is, however, far more to Olive Schreiner than that novel. She had a wide circle of correspondence, amongst them people with influence. There is, in fact, far more to Olive Schreiner than we can ever hope to say in this short hour. There were, however, two questions which dominated her thinking throughout her adult life. These were, and I have called them the world's great question, as she did, and the world's other great question. In a letter to Jan Smuts, she said, "Dear Jan, thank you for your kind words of welcome. I wish that you and Issy were down here now. Do try and get Issy down when you come down for Parliament. I would like to have a long talk with you on the native question, not only South Africa's great question, but the world's great question." And the second great question, I thought I stood in heaven before God's throne, and God asked me what I'd come for. I said I'd come to arraign my brother man. God said, "What has he done?" I said, "He has taken my sister woman and stricken her and wounded her and thrust her into the streets. She lies there prostrate. His hands are red with blood." It comes from one of Olive Schreiner's allegories in the book Dreams, which was published in 1890. And one needs to keep in mind both Schreiner's stance on racism and on gender equality. We keep those in mind when we look back 100 years later. The biographer Lyndall Gordon has listed Olive Schreiner with 5 other women novelists as women who changed the world. Interestingly, 3 of the 5 were forced, at least initially, to write under pseudonyms, men's names. She also makes a comparison between Schreiner and Charlotte Bronte. I'll come back a little bit to that later, but she says Schreiner is the Charlotte Bronte of South Africa. And interestingly, Schreiner was also influenced by George Eliot. She recognized herself in Eliot's autobiographical novel, I Love the Mill on the Floss. Let's look what Olive Schreiner wrote. She wrote 4 novels, The Story of an African Farm, and of course, Peter Halkett. Schreiner once said that she would like on her tombstone to have written, "She wrote Trooper Peter Halkett." And then the 2 novels which were published posthumously, Undini and the unfinished From Man to Man, which she considered her finest work. We will be discussing 3 of the novels this morning. Then there were the allegories, short imaginative pieces, mostly on aspects of the plight of women. He wrote a number of political and liberation pieces. Christine will be talking about one of them a little bit later. And she wrote letters, 15,000 of them. But what else do you do when you live in places like Hanover, Makiesfontein, and De Aar? 5,000 of these letters remain. Many of her correspondents were people of influence, and Schreiner, too, was a person of influence. Here are 5 of the many of her correspondence. And incidentally, Schreiner was godmother to Sol Plaatje's daughter, Olive. In 1885, Olive Emily Albertina, the 9th of 12 children of Gottlob Schreiner, of German extraction, and Rebecca Schreiner, born Lyndall, missionaries in South Africa, sponsored by the London Mission Society, was born on 24th of March. at Wittenbergen Mission Station, Basutoland. She was named after 3 brothers who died in infancy. There you can see a picture on the screen of where the mission station was. They were a talented family. A brother 2 years her junior became Prime Minister of the Cape, lawyer, anti-British imperialist. Theo, an elder brother, was a school headmaster and for a time a senator at the Cape. Etty, an elder sister, and Theo worked together for a long time as temperance workers. She was also the founder and headmistress of a school. Something which was to affect Olive was the death at the age of 1 year of a beloved younger sister, Ellie, to whom she dedicated From Man to Man. And that was when Olive lost her Orthodox faith. When Olive was 6, she began a semi-nomadic pattern of moving from place to place, which was to last until her death in 1920. And it's shown on this slide, where she moves repeatedly from South Africa to Europe, back, and so on, through a great number of moves. We will come back to the slide as we go on. As situation deteriorated, the Schreiner family moved to Cat River Mission settlement in Haroldstown, and a few years later to Belfast. And when he became insolvent, Olive and Will went to live in Craddock. Theo, who was headmaster at school, and Etty, who had started a school for girls. And there's the house, which is now the Olive Schreiner Museum. When Theo and Etty went to Kimberley, Olive became a governess. She moved around the Eastern Cape, and in this period met interesting people, read widely, and she wrote. And then she eventually went to England with the hope of studying medicine. We've gone, as you see, from Craddock, Colesberg, Klein-Gunnerhook, and then she arrived in England in Eastbourne. And she went to hoping to study medicine, which didn't happen, or nursing, which also didn't happen. And as I mentioned, she wrote. And in 1883, Chapman and Hall accepted the story of an African farm.
Thank you, Andrew. We are now in 1883, the year in which, while living in England, she had her most famous novel published, The Story of an African Farm. Christine will now talk about The Story of an African Farm, which I'm sure most of you have read at least once. Thank you, Christine.
History is full of examples of people pretending to be part of pastoral life, like Marie Antoinette and her well-washed sheep, pretending to be a shepherdess. Schreiner does not have to pretend. She knows what farming is. Farming to her is real life. Things have definitely moved on in the shepherd and sheep world since Marie Antoinette and her ladies played at stock farming with their well-washed sheep and costumes the real world would have loved to be able to afford.
A tranquil life on an African farm is disrupted by the arrival of a stranger.
Bonaparte Blenkinsman.
He's a highly respectable man.
I'll have no tramps sleeping on my farm.
Unearthing a story of greed.
Who's that girl?
This is nice. But these, Mary, all the good ones are taken.
A story of betrayal.
I think he wants to feel it. Come on.
And deception.
I have the heart of a devil, do I?
She's an evil, wicked woman.
What have you been poisoning her mind with?
What are you doing up there? Huh?
Just a pride and anger and greed and lies. And he has lied. No!
A story of courage.
Leave her alone.
And love.
I'm telling you, Trana, that man.
That's fine. Good. Little M.
You are crying. What's the matter?
You child of a dog! Come here! You old vagabond of a praying German!
What is it?
I have the heart of a devil, do I? You could run me through with a knife, could you? I could have drive the maid away because I was afraid of you, was I?
What?
I loved you, did I? I wanted to marry you, do I? Do I, you devil's tongue, you rat's tail?
I don't understand.
Ask him! Ask him! He knows! You thought he wouldn't tell me, but he did! He did, you old fool! You old beggar!
He lies!
Do not approach me, do not address me, lost man. This woman has been your benefactress, and how have you rewarded her? Basely, basely, basely.
What have you been poisoning her mind with?
Get off my land, you dog!
You will not let me speak.
You've spoken enough! I would have been a rich woman if it wasn't for your laziness.
Quite.
You would have been poor, Tanzani. And you are even poorer now. Poor in spirit and poor in charity.
You dare talk to me about charity? After I kept you and that little half-caste of yours like I did. And you stand there all righteous. Well, it doesn't fool me anymore. Oh, no.
Yes, I have sinned. But it was done for love. This is a different kind of sin. This is pride and anger and greed and lies. And he has light. And you are a foolish woman. I will not live as fools and liars. I feel sorry for you, Tanzani. Sorry. Do not fret so much. All will be well.
If you are here by sunrise, my laborers will drag you in the sand till there's no bone left in your body.
She's an evil, wicked woman.
We are all sinners.
I'll keep everything, even your horse for all the sheep that you lost. Be off my land by sunrise!
Come in. We won't stay to listen to such lies.
So, you will defy me too, you Englishman ugliness! Don't you?
Leave her alone.
You! Off my farm! See what you've done!
Good riddance!
Little devils! I'll teach you!
Let us out or we'll break the door down!
We have all been introduced now to the main characters. Lyndall, the head heroine, stepdaughter of Tant Sunny. M, stepniece of Tant Sunny. Waldo Farber, the son of Otto Farber, has yet to be met. And then Tant Sunny, the little volcano, the owner of the farm. And Otto Farber, the lovely, gentle caretaker of the farm. And the hideous Bonaparte Blenken's manipulative recent arrival. We haven't seen Gregory Rose, but he will appear as a tenant on the farm. Olive Schreiner was well acquainted with the life of farmers and their shepherds. In 1878, as a governess at Hammerhoek near Cradock, she was able to do a lot of writing after educating her charges for 5 hours a day. Many would have considered it a boring place to live, but she was happy. This is a wild, beautiful place. The farmhouse is perched high up on the side of one of the mountains, and the bush which comes down to the very garden is as unman-defiled as one can wish. It was here she wrote The Story of an African Farm, and she also produced Ndine and From Man to Man. The African Farm contains the beautiful and intellectual Lyndall, raging against the domestic role she is expected to play, and a future marriage which will turn her into an accessory of some man or other. M, the future owner of the farm, regards marriage as a way to escape from her subordinate role in the farm and from the hugely overweight and bullying Tanzani. Lyndall feels trapped in her life as a woman. Look at this little chin of mine, Waldo, with a dimple in it. It is but a small part of my person, but had I the knowledge of all things under the sun and the wisdom to use it, and the deep loving heart of an angel, it would not stead me through life like this little chin. I can win money with it. I can win power with it. I can win fame. What would knowledge help me? The less a woman has in her head, the lighter she is for climbing. There is a deep irony in the fact that Lyndall and Waldo, both seekers after truth, are the ones who do not survive. The decent and kindly German overseer Otto is no match for the nasty, satanic Bonaparte Blenkens, a hideous creature and a horrendous liar with a story to fit any occasion. He is, however, a born survivor. Only Lyndall sees through this callous parasite, who, after being treated with kindness by Otto, replaces him as farm manager. Otto dies a broken man, and Otto's son, Waldo, is beaten and humiliated by Blenkens. Although Tanzani, another survivor, escapes marrying Blenkens by the skin of her teeth, he marries well, and so does she. Lyndall takes up with a self-absorbed young Englishman, lives with him, bears his child, which dies in a day, and when he departs, is nursed by Gregory Rose, M's eventual husband. The child is already buried. Her life is over. Of course, the whole pivot of an African farm turns on Lyndall being a child of 17 when she dies, with a tiny body and dark brown hair and large intellectual brown eyes. If she'd been a full-grown woman, the book wouldn't have been written. And Waldo, Lyndall's spiritual companion, another seeker after truth, another casualty. He meets a stranger who develops an allegory of the hunter after truth. People are still arguing about this one. The simplest is that hunting truth is a human process, and Waldo perceives only a little of it. Others will come after him to help him. He dies, his journey uncompleted, and Schreiner must have the last word. The tragedy of the whole book is the eternal tragedy of youth and genius and beauty, struggling against adverse material conditions and being hurt by them. It is a cry against fate.
She continues with her nomadic existence and spent several more years in England before returning to South Africa in 1890. She met some very influential people while she was living in Europe, and that influenced her writing. Andrew's going to tell us a little bit more about some of the interesting events from this period.
Well, the people she met is a long list. Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson amongst them, and one in particular was Havelock Ellis. Henry Havelock Ellis was an English physician, writer, progressive intellectual, and social reformer who studied human sexuality. He co-wrote the first medical textbook in English on homosexuality in 1897, and also published works on a variety of sexual practices and inclinations, as well as on transgender psychology. He married Edith Lees, who was openly lesbian, a campaigner for women's lib, and when she was dying eventually in 1916, Schreiner nursed her through her final illness. In 1890, Schreiner returned to South Africa and moved to Maatjiesfontein. And here she wrote to Havelock Ellis in 1890. She was lonely there. There was no one worth meeting in South Africa, except for that one man she had heard of. It was Cecil Rhodes, the head of the charter company. Rhodes had been impressed with the story of an African farm, and they did meet, whether it was in Maatjiesfontein bought his impressive residence, Grooteskuur, she was impressed not only by the man, but by his stature in society. She thought him a millionaire philanthropist. In 1894, she married Samuel Cronwright, a man 8 years her junior, who immediately changed his name to Cronwright Schreiner. I'll come back to him a little bit more later. And they moved to Kimberley for her health. Her asthma was getting bad. The only child born to the marriage died at the age of 1 day, and she suffered a series of miscarriages. But back to Rhodes. When he voted in favor of the Strop Bill in the Western Cape Parliament, Schreiner was not happy. That divided the family. Schreiner's brother Will became a member of Rhodes's cabinet and continued to support Rhodes until his complicity in the Jameson raid became certain. But by 1896, the information on what was happening in Mashonaland became known to Schreiner and led to writing of Trooper Peter Halkett. But that was not the only issue. The goings on in Mashonaland itself, but imperialism in general, which is reflected in the book. Rhodes was recalled to London. Schreiner, her brother, and her husband were on the same ship, but the two parties did not speak to each other. Schreiner had with her the manuscript of her novel. Peter Halkett is a young man who joined the forces of the Charter Company in Mashonaland. One night he is separated from his unit and prepares himself by lighting a fire on top of the kopje where he is. He's a simple man, and in the darkness he considers how he is going to make his fortune. Here he is joined by a stranger who is Jesus. A long conversation takes place where Halkett describes and tries to justify the methods of the Charter Company in dealing with dissident, in inverted commas, niggers, and in buying and selling and treatment of black women. Jesus convinces him it is not only the Charter Company atrocities in Mashonaland that is wrong, but all high-handed imperialism. So indeed, Schreiner was concerned with the imperialism against the Boer republics. One of the stories that Jesus tells, that long conversation, is that of the pastor who says, "It's because I'm an Englishman that these things crush me. Better that 10,000 of us should lie dead and defeated on one battlefield, fighting for some great cause, and my own sons among them, than that those 12 poor boys should have fallen at Doornkop, fighting to fill up the pockets of those already heavy with gold." In the second part of the book, Schreiner takes us to the camp where the soldiers in the company have caught, again in inverted commas, a nigger, accused him of spying, and will execute him in the morning. Halkett's friends consider that he has gone loopy since this time on that kopje. And he has had an altercation with the captain when he tried to defend the unfortunate prisoner, and has been punished by being put on guard duty for the day. Sometime in the night, Halkett steals out and frees the prisoner. The captain hears something moving, comes out of his tent and shoots Halkett. The incident will be reported as enemy coming to rescue the prisoner, having shot the trooper. There was an outcry over the book. But what probably caused as much controversy as the novel itself was the photograph, with Schreiner included, showing the hanging of 3 men in Mashonaland. This only appeared in the first edition and not in any subsequent editions of the book until 1974.
Right. An interesting period that, Andrew, her association with Rhodes and how her admiration changed to dislike and disapproval. Very interesting, quite shocking, that photograph. And of course, soon after, the Second Boer War, broke out, and she was living in Hanover at the time. Christine, you're going to pick up for us that period. And we must remember the use of terms like nigger and so on. We're living 100 years later from a society where these words were more frequently used. So when we put it in inverted commas, it's our modern sensibilities. Not that we are more sensitive, it's just that the use of language changes. But let's go on to the Boer War, another fascinating period of her life, and a very torturous one.
Olive Schreiner spent much of the Boer War in Hanover, which I've passed through on numerous occasions, ignorant of its connection with Olive Schreiner, and it was one of the nastier incidents of the Boer War. I'm confining myself to one hideous event. Schreiner lived under martial law in Hanover from 1900 and left in 1907. Her cottage can still be seen. In one letter, she says, "Hell is martial law, with life in one room, boxes for furniture, and a camp bed." Her husband was not allowed to visit, and vice versa. Every letter was censored, and no travel outside the town allowed. She was more frightened of the town guard, a multiracial crew who popped off their rifles at just about anything. The war was all around, with cannons on the koppies, and 20,000 British soldiers trying to catch Tibet and 3,000, which they never did. On 19th March 1901, 3 men, very poor and with little education, Darrell Nienaber, J.P. Nienaber, and J.A. Nieuwhout, were found guilty of attacking a train, were tied to chairs and shot at dawn, betrayed by one of their own, Van der Berg, who by 27th of July 1902 was accusing Petrus Andries Pienaar, who lived on the same farm as his accuser, of the same crime. Schreiner had been busy. She had raised money to feed the impoverished families and had done her best to save the first 3, only to be told that orders had come from on high to execute them. 2 others were jailed for 5 years, leaving their family penniless. By the 27th of July 1902, things had changed. The war is over. The last of the train wreckers was to be charged. Schreiner had collected evidence on his behalf and dragged her husband in to represent Pienaar. She, as the stenographer of the court, she was able to write everything down. These are her own words. Our case defending Pienaar, the man who was charged with murder and train wrecking, lasted from the Friday of one week to the Friday of the next. We did all we could to get a shorthand writer from Cradock, but none would come through. We would have paid anything for it. So I had to sit next to Cron and report. I think I got every word down in both questions and answers. It's always translated, and that gave time to write. We fortunately have a good magistrate here, an Englishman, Mr. Strong, who, though very strong on the English side, conducted the case with impartiality, which would not have been the case if we'd still had that terrible man from Reinbold, who was here till some months ago. The chief witness against Pienaar is a man called Van der Berg, the man through whose evidence our 3 Hanover men were executed at the Aar. He went about boasting before the trial that he had got 3 of his fellow Afrikaners shot, and he would have a 4th, Pienaar. But he will find out he was mistaken. We not only have a number of witnesses that can show he was on the train with the men against whom he returned Queen's evidence, but we got Commandant Milan as a witness who swears he never spoke to this man and never to his knowledge saw him. Milan gave his evidence splendidly. I think the most terrible thing I've ever seen in my life was when when we brought the murderer face to face with Milan in court. Cron says he wishes he had never seen it. It will haunt him to his dying day, that mean wild animal's face of the man who's brought 3 innocent men to death. There was no remorse, no feeling, but it was like the face of a wild animal who sees the net tightly about it. One feels as if it was a terrible thing to be human, as if one's own humanity were degraded in him.
This is in a letter to Mrs. Maltino. During this period, she would have also written several other letters, but she comments on the role that at one point she calls him Commandant, and another point she calls him General Milan. What happened to him? He was pivotal in this case, and she clearly admired his role. What happened to him after the war?
Well, this remarkable man, she says he was one of the most remarkable men I have ever seen. He was an individual, as much an individual as Rhodes or Paul. Cron made a very good remark about him when he said he was like a volcano under ice. After the war, he married an English woman. And I think it was a bit of a touchy subject at the time. So he and his father took the English wife and journeyed up to the north. And he died in Tanganyika in 1953. They actually went to Kenya, which is a little, I think, ironic, considering he was on the other side of the war.
Yes, of course. During the Great Trek, you will remember, several of the Boers went all the way up to Kenya and founded settlements there at Eldoret. Well, that's very interesting. Do we have any idea of any other people she may have written to during this period? Because her letters are very important.
Yes. She wrote many letters to Betty Maltino and the great woman, Emily Hobhouse, who made so much trouble in her life for men, and Icy Smuts and her husband, Itty.
Itty, thank you.
By the way, her last words on the trial were the relations of the three men were in court. All the world will soon know they were perfectly innocent. Then I shall be able to die in peace. The death of these three men has eaten into the core of my being. And she was the woman who raised the money to give them the memorial. And you can see the memorial to the three men in Hanover inscribed with, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay."
Thank you. If we now look at her timeline again, you'll see it takes us to her death in 1920. But of course, we need to go back to the period when the war was over, and she moves on and writes what she also thought demonstrated her political and social thinking in a very important work called Women and Labour. A very, very interesting work, which Christine is now going to talk about.
The book was destroyed when her Johannesburg house was wrecked and all her writings piled up in a heap in the corner of her room and the contents burned. She only found the leather-bound back of Women and Labour. At the age of 18, Olive Schreiner heard from a black woman just what life was like for a woman born into tribal society. In language more eloquent than I have ever heard from the lips of any other woman, she painted the condition of the women of her race, the labour of women, the anguish of women as she grew older, and limitations of her life closed in around her, her sufferings under the condition of polygamy and subjection. And what impressed Schreiner was that the woman accepted her lot as being necessary, given the conditions in which her society existed. Schreiner came to believe that when these conditions changed, so could woman's position in society. The sufferings of pregnancy were also a burden on woman, but she was ensuring the continuation of her race. Schreiner was no stranger to this condition, having many pregnancies, none of which produced children to care for. Readers of the Old Testament will have noticed the many strong women who populated. Schreiner, however, points out that Solomon, with his 700 parasitic wives and 300 parasitic concubines, was not exactly encouraging the progress of women. There was also this belief that where men were required to fight the enemy and chase animals for meat, the women brought up the children, tended the fields and domestic animals, and clothed a tribe. There are exceptions to this. Teutonic women fought with their men at times, not against them. In modern times, things began to change, partly due to the advances in technology producing the factory instead of the shed at the side of the house, the spinning wool in the kitchen. We then have the factory. Admission to the skilled trades was resisted by men, but thousands of women worked as domestic servants and in other less well-paid jobs. As the 19th and 20th century progressed, many women became skilled and semi-skilled workers outside of the house. Unfortunately, those who failed to gain a foothold in this new world often drifted into prostitution, which Schreiner abhors but understands. She does not feel that the two sexes should not enjoy sexual activity. Indeed, it can deepen and enrich a relationship. Are women as intelligent as men? For example, in mathematics and science. Naturally, Schreiner says she is, but must work and study, as she also did. She also slyly notes that Hindus are not good at sport, but may in future improve. As the century went on, she notes that the poor men had their urge to rise, but wealthy women had the same ambition.
Now, she developed her social philosophy and her political views, which she expounds on in this work, but you're going to look at two particular case studies that she used as the foundation to hone her thinking about woman and labour.
I'm going to give you two cases of these, and you will see the connection between both. The most helpless case of female degeneration we ever came in contact with was that of a daughter of a poor English officer on half pay, and who had to exist on a few hundreds a year. This woman could neither cook her own food nor make her own clothes, nor was she engaged in any social, political, or intellectual or artistic labour. Though able to dance for a night or play tennis for an afternoon, she was yet hardly able to do her own hair or attire herself, and appeared absolutely to have lost all power of compelling herself to do anything which was at the moment fatiguing or displeasing, as all labour is apt to be, however great its ultimate reward. In a life of 28 years, this woman had probably not contributed 1 hour's earnest toil, mental or physical, to the increase of the sum total of productive human labour. Surrounded with acres of cultivable land, she would possibly have preferred to lie down and die of hunger than have cultivated half an acre of food. This is an extreme case, but the ultimate effect of parasitism is always a paralysis of the will and an inability to compel oneself into any course of action, for the moment unpleasurable and exhaustive. You can see the upper class to which Olive was aiming her arrows. Here's the second one. The wife of an American millionaire was visited by a woman, the daughter and also the widow of small professional men. She stated that she was in need of both food and clothing. The millionaire's wife gave her a leg of mutton and 2 valuable dresses. The woman proceeded to whine, though in vigorous health, that she had no one to carry them home for her, and could not think of carrying them herself. The American, the descendant of generations of able labouring New England Puritan women, tucked the leg of mutton under one arm and a bundle of clothes under the other, and walked off down the city street towards the woman's dwelling, followed by the astonished pauper parasite.
So parasites are what she did not like and thought that men relied on them to be parasitic. Very interesting view of the relationship between men and women. This is one of her most influential works because it shows us what direction her thinking was taking when she was writing her novels from her own experience. And this was really quite an exercise in the development of her social philosophy. But now her semi-nomadic existence continues. She continues to write, she continues to work, but her health is failing. Andrew?
As we go a little bit into fast forward here, she remained in England through the duration of the World War and returned to the Cape, where she died in Wynberg of that year. She was buried in the family burial plot, but Cronwright, who'd been in England at the time, came rushing back, took possession of all her papers, had her body exhumed and reburied at Buffels Corp near Craddock. And a couple of words about Cronwright. Of course, he was a man of many parts. He was a farmer, lawyer, businessman, writer, and amongst his books, he wrote one on the migration of the springbok in the Northern Cape. So he took possession of all her papers and became the editor of her novels and her biographer. In fact, it was only 6 years later that the book From Man to Man was published. She began writing it, of course, as early as 1887 and went through many revisions before it was published. Cronwright added to this unfinished novel a note of how she told him the book would end. What I'm going to say about it are my own views on fairly quick reading, and they're not the views of her editors. Incidentally, I find most 19th century literature quite slow reading. This one I could not put down. Cronwright destroyed the manuscripts of many of her letters, something which has made later editing very difficult. And the Australian editor, Professor Dorothy Driver, has since given another ending based on modern scholarship. I believe that Schreiner did not finish the book because she had finished the book. The point at which the book ends is the right point, and anything more is superfluous. Let me explain. The story is of two sisters who grow up on an Eastern Cape farm. There is a lovely description how the child Rebecca wanders the farm on the day little sister Bertie is born. The section ends with the 5-year-old fast asleep and the baby also fast asleep, holding hands in the cot. Rebecca marries her cousin Frank, and they live in Cape Town. Rebecca is very much a self-portrait of Olive. She's short, dark, reads widely, philosophizes, and is also practical. She buys a small farm in the peninsula, which she eventually turns to profit. One point in the book, there's a long soliloquy, which Rebecca, writing a diary, gives her views on the world, partly influenced by Darwin. Schreiner's views on both imperialism and the state of women come out clearly here too. Is there really any superiority at all implied in degrees of pigmentation? And are the European races, except in their egotistic distortion of imagination, more desirable or highly developed than the Asiatic? And a few places later, she said, it is not alone through the physical destruction and annihilation of the weak by the brutally stronger that we have suffered. What has humanity not lost by suppression and subjection of the weaker sex by the muscularly stronger sex alone? We have a Shakespeare, but what of the possible Shakespeares we might have had who passed life from youth upwards, brewing currant wine and making pastries for the fat country squires to eat, with no glimpse of the freedom of life and action, simply because being the weaker sex, life gave no room for action and a grasp on life. Frank, in the story, is unfaithful to Rebecca almost from the start. She discovers this, but does not confront him. She writes him letters, but he does not read them. She knows at least two of the women concerned, but does not confront them either. It is only when she discovers her husband at night coming from the outer room occupied by the young servant girl that she takes action. There is a powerful scene as Rebecca, heavily pregnant, goes to the outer room to confront the servant girl, who is never named in the novel. The green wooden shutter of the servant girl's bedroom was thrown open, but the door was still shut. Rebecca passed across the yard to it. Then she stood for a moment and glanced back at the sparrows and the sunshine, and then she knocked at the door. At first there was no answer, and she knocked again. Then a voice called out in Cape Dutch, "Who is there?" Rebecca said softly, "It is I." She opened the door. She stood for a moment before she stepped down the one step that led into the room. Before the window on the side of her single bed, the servant girl was sitting. She was half dressed. Her short black wool, with difficulty parted, was combed out to stand in two solid masses, each side of her head. Her small dark face, with its puckered forehead, even a little blacker than the rest, was raised to Rebecca as she opened the door. She had on a red striped flannel petticoat and a pair of crimson satin corsets, embroidered with white flowers. Above the corsets, from a mass of frilled white lace, showed her puny black arms and bare shoulders. On the bed beside her lay a white nightdress, heavy with bows. On the other side lay the serge dress she was just going to put on. The girl placed a closed fist on each of her hips and raised her chin, looking at Rebecca through her half-closed twinkling eyes. "Wat wil jy hê?" she said, throwing her chin yet higher. Rebecca stood silent. All she had determined to say passed from her. The girl threw back her head yet further and burst into a laugh, intended to be defiant, but with an undertone of fear, all her white teeth showing between her thick dark lips as she sat with her fists on her hips. Then, as Rebecca looked at her, Rebecca knew that it was with that girl, even as it was with herself that day. Softly she turned and went out. She closed the door behind her, almost on tiptoe. Softly and quickly she ran across the yard, like one who fears something that is following them and tries to escape. She disappeared through the back door. In one sentence, Rebecca accepts that the plight of women and the issue of race are linked and universal. In the meantime, in the novel, Bertie, just after Rebecca left the farm, has been seduced by her tutor and has given herself to him. When she admits this in honesty to her would-be husband, who is Frank's brother, he refuses at first to marry her. Later, he relents, but it is too late. She flees from the farm to stay with Rebecca in Cape Town. He marries a rather hateful woman who spreads this rumor about Bertie. The rumor gets to Cape Town. Bertie is ostracized, and she flees to live with her aunt in Cradock. At first, the many talents and retiring disposition that she has make her popular, but when the rumor of her indiscretion as a teenager reaches there, she again flees and ends up as the kept woman of a man referred only in the book as the Jew. Perhaps this racial slur, along with the repeated use of the K word to describe black inhabitants of what Schreiner calls Kafreria, make the book distasteful to modern ears. We last see Bertie being rescued to become the kept woman of another man. Later, we hear from her being in a brothel in Soho. Schreiner is illustrating this point, the point she makes in Women in Labour, that Victorian marriage was just another form of prostitution. At the end of the book, we find Rebecca still living in the same house with her husband, but separated from him. She has adopted the girl child of the servant girl and her husband, whom she is bringing up with her 4 young boys and attempting to educate them that race does not matter. She meets Drummond, her neighbor, and incidentally the husband of one of Frank's lovers, who as a scientist, has been traveling in the East for the past 12 years. He and she become conversationally intimate, but when he invites her to see his fossil collection in the outside room of his house, she refuses. The book ends there. Rebecca has found that there is a man who meets her ideal, and that must be enough. For her now, marriage or sexual relationship is neither possible nor necessary. She has spoken with him as from man to man. She will continue on her own to bring up her mixed race family as well as she can in a hostile society. From man to man illustrates and reinforces Schreiner's views on race and gender. Schreiner is not able to grant her heroines or hero the joy of a happy ending. She is unlike Charlotte Bronte in this respect. The battles that her heroine must face, or all her heroines, will still be on the front page of our newspapers a few hundred years later. So let's just go back to the questions which I read at the start. I would like to have a long talk with you on the native question, not only South Africa's great question, but the world's great question. And he has taken my sister, woman, and stricken her, and wounded her, and thrust her into the streets. She lies there prostrate. His hands are red with blood.
Thank you, Andrew. Right, thank you. That brings us to the end of this glimpse into Olive Schreiner, one of the most remarkable women in the history of South Africa. Thank you, Christine and Andrew, for enlightening us. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all three of you for a fascinating lecture, for the preparation, for the insight into the life of this amazing woman, and for the way that you've been able to set out her philosophy and the content of some of her most important works. Now it's time for questions. The floor is open. Anybody who wishes to ask a question, please go ahead. I would like to ask a question. Andrew, your wife's name is also Lindahl. Is there a connection between her and Olive Schreiner?
Yeah, her mother was a great women's lib person, and she was named after the Lindell of the story.
I thought there must be some connection.
It's Robin speaking. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was enlightening, and I'm interested in the fact that her writing came out of situations of conflict between her views and what was socially or politically or economically acceptable. And it raises the whole question of opposition to your current environment as a motivation to write either novels or other non-fiction works. Do you see her actually driven, not so much by a positive force inside herself, but as a reaction to the negative things she saw going on in her society?
Robin, I would say yes, definitely. But there, Lyndall Gordon perhaps has the last say of one of 5 women that changed the world, and they're probably all driven in the same way. Does that answer?
Then I just clarify, you say the same way, which way? By an inner conviction of her views, or a position taken up in public by her opposition to what was happening in her society?
My own feeling is that she clearly had an independent spirit and a questioning mind, but that there was also very strong reaction to what she saw happening around her, the inequality, the injustice, she clearly experienced that as well. I mean, she grew up quite poor, and they as a family struggled. And especially moving around as she did as a nomad, she'd have come across so much of the situations that she depicts in her writing. So I think it was probably a bit of both, that there was this inborn sense of independence and justice, but a very strong reaction, which came out in her creations, a very strong reaction to the society that she found herself in.
Can I just continue? So it must be then a situation in which she had inner convictions about aspects of life and position of women, and the society which she inhabited gave form to these, so that the location of an African farm is a vehicle through which she is conveying her own inner convictions as they clash with the reality of the society.
Yes, I think that's right. Christine?
Looking at the life of the middle and lower upper classes, she obviously finds that they, in a strange sort of way, are deprived of being the people they could be because they are too frightened to go out and face what she faced.
Thank you.
Pat Hart here. Can I ask a question?
Please.
She corresponded with all the high and the mighty. Were they receptive to what she said? Did they come back to her? Are there a lot of letters from them back to her?
Yes, a lot of her letters were destroyed in Johannesburg, but she was in communication with a lot of people, although she seems to have been very fond of people like Betty Mortino and so on. No, she corresponded widely, and unfortunately we don't have any of those letters, but some of the letters we have been reading are in the collections of various universities worldwide and in South Africa. So obviously the people who received the letters valued them and kept them.
Thank you.
Andrew, in your narrative about her movements, it wasn't clear to me why she spent so much time in Britain.
She thought she could go and get some medical training to begin with. That is what was her motivation in the first place. She wanted to be a doctor, and then she wanted to be a nurse. So to begin with, that is why she went. And of course, those hopes were not realized. I think that is why she went in the first place, just for more opportunity, and then met interesting people and developed her worldview. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, but later as well. She spent the whole of the First World War in Britain.
I think she got stuck there.
Yeah, she was.
Any last comments from any one of you?
Yes, thank you. You know, before working on this presentation some months ago with Andrew and Christine, I will admit to not having read any of her work except The Story of an African Farm. And it has been a most interesting, informative, and invigorating experience to understand this remarkable woman. So for me, it has really been a very enlightening experience. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, all of you again. I'm going to close the meeting now. Goodbye.